Growing up, I hated the summers. My friends and classmates would start the new school year going on and on about the fun things they did during break, like going to water parks, rec centers, or going to a camp where they told scary stories around the fire and ate marshmallows. I had nothing to share. From the time I was in first grade till the time I was in fourth grade, my stories were boring and mundane. That is, until one year when I was 11, and I came back with a story that was not fun or boring at all, but absolutely terrifying. My summer break sucked because my parents would always send me to my grandfather's, a tradition that started for seemingly no reason. He lived a couple of towns away, his old Victorian house surrounded by farmland, looking for all. The world like the place from the first Conjuring movie. There was even a creepy forest of birch trees and a still murky pond nearby. Grandpa was a tall, skinny and pale man with a bald head that reminded me of a big speckled egg, a large hooked nose that reminded me of a witch's, and beady dark eyes. That never seemed to sparkle with joy at anything, not even the sight of his grandson, whom he only saw once a year. He dressed in dull colors all the time, sweater vests and button-ups with these slacks I thought people only wore when they went to church or attended a funeral. He was quiet and clearly didn't like people. He would yell at any visitors and had "Say beware of dog" sign even though he hated dogs. He had no pets. The sign was just to ward off trespassers. Living there for a few consecutive months was torturous for a modern kid like me. His TV was one of the few left that had a large back and an antenna. Most channels were not available, and whatever kids' show I could watch were either super religious, like poorly animated Bible stories, or lame learning programs for toddlers, like Coco Melon but somehow more unbearable, and from the 90s. The only other things I could do were either read a book, play with the 2 toys I was allowed to bring, or go outside and play. Not before doing my chores though, of course. Each Sunday he took me to a church in the closest town, and throughout the week he forced me to assist him with various volunteer jobs here and there, like at the soup kitchen or handing out resources to the homeless outside. I know that doesn't sound too bad, but being out in the sweltering sun with absolutely no shade, handing out sample deodorants and food cans to the needy was hellish for a kid who just wanted to watch cable TV and play his Nintendo DS that he sadly had to leave at home. Every night we prayed before bed and said grace before every meal. The meals themselves were quite bland. My parents were great cooks, and all his food was poorly seasoned in comparison and mostly boiled until it took on a pale, unappetizing color. While he wasn't the most affectionate grandfather in the world, I did have the sense that he cared for me. He just was one of those people who didn't exactly know how to show it, I guess. He always asked if my dinner was good after I ate the last bite, and I always lied and told him yes. He would also ask if I wanted to hear a bedtime story, but I always said no and reminded him that I was too old for them, or at least I had thought as much. The summer before I would start 5th grade, something unexplainable happened. He changed. When my mum dropped me off, parking her beat-up Cadillac in the yard and pushing me towards the door, I felt something was off about the whole place. I couldn't put my finger on it, and I remember looking around as Mom and I stood on the porch, and she knocked and knocked to no answer and thinking, "It's so quiet." I didn't hear birds or squirrels. The breeze we felt earlier was gone, meaning the trees were still and I couldn't even hear toads croaking by the pond. Finally, Grandpa answered the door, peeking through a crack. He looked shaken. There was an expression on his face I'd never seen before. He seemed paler than usual, and his eyes were opened a little wider than necessary. He looked at us as if he'd forgotten that we were coming, as if I hadn't come on the same day every year, as if Mom hadn't spoken to him over the phone a week in advance like she does each time. "Dad, are you okay?" Mom asked. Grandpa blinked, as if coming back to reality. He shook his head and opened the door wider. "Sorry, I was only sleeping." I immediately knew he had to be lying. He always got up at the same time and stayed awake all throughout the day until bedtime. He always stuck to a strict routine, and if anything threw him off that routine, he would get angry and become silent for the whole day. Like always, Mom stayed long enough to have lunch with us at the long rectangular dining table Grandpa had. I always thought it was funny how big it was, considering he lived alone. Apparently his wife, my grandma, died before I was born. Anyway, We ate tuna sandwiches cut into neat triangles with toothpicks, spearing olives sticking out of them. Drank prune juice, and Mom was on her way. I was prepared for another uninteresting summer, wishing I was riding roller coasters or swimming in community pools like my friends. Things started to get strange a couple of days in. I woke up at 6 a.m. because I was pretty much foresaid to. He had set the alarm clock on my nightstand to ring at that time, same as his. After cleaning up and dressing, I went downstairs to watch the old TV while I waited for Grandpa to start cooking breakfast as always. 2 hours in, my eyes glued to the screen, I suddenly became painfully aware of the fact that I couldn't hear Grandpa walking around, nor did I hear food cooking. I stood up from my spot, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, and when I turned around, my heart stopped. Grandpa was standing there behind the couch, still in his striped pajamas. He stared at me with these soulless eyes, his mouth partially open as if I were some weird specimen he hadn't seen before. And it disgusted him. How long had he been like that? And why wasn't he dressed yet? He loved routine, so why did he break it, Grandpa? I was concerned for him after I got over the initial shock of seeing him standing there. He was old, but his mind was actually quite sharp. He had never done anything like this before. He didn't say anything. He just stared, as if looking through me. "Grandpa?" I said more urgently, wondering if I needed to call someone. "More? What?" I frowned. "More what?" He seemed to snap out of it then. His eyes blinked rapidly, and he finally seemed to look as if he could actually register my existence. He looked down at himself and started grumbling in frustration. Damn it! I watched him march upstairs to go change. Honestly, I didn't know what to think of what just happened. I got over it pretty quickly. I mean, yeah, it was weird, but I trusted him and figured he just had a brain fart or something. We had a late breakfast during which he pushed his food around, muttering under his breath about something I couldn't make out. I swallowed the runny, poached eggs and got the courage to ask, "Grandpa, is something wrong?" I just haven't gotten much sleep lately. He waved me away, looking grouchy and not even making eye contact with me. "Don't worry about it. Are we doing anything? Today?" I was so bored I was actually looking forward to charity work. "No, I'm going back tubed. I don't feel well." Grandpa got up, angrily wiping his mouth with a napkin, and stormed upstairs. I was left there feeling uncomfortable, wondering if I did something to make him angry. He stayed in bed all day, and when I tried to wake him, to make dinner when evening came, he told me to make myself a ham sandwich and put myself to bed. Instead, I went outside to explore. I stood by the pond and skipped rocks, wondering if I could use everything that was happening as a way to get out of coming there next year. A creeping sense of unease came over me as I realized once again how eerie quiet it was. I didn't hear any bugs, animals, or anything like usual. In fact, there were quite a lot of dead frogs, turtles, and lizards floating along the pond's surface, more than what felt normal. By the tree where an old tire swing hung, a bird lay, on its back, rotting next to cracked little eggshells. I tried not to think about it as I searched for more rocks to throw. I wanted to believe I was too old to get scared by such things. What I couldn't ignore, however, was the bubbling sound in the pond. Where one of the rocks I threw landed, far out into the middle, the water bubbled a little. Then, ripples formed, a V shape, traveling towards the shore in my direction, as if something under the surface was swimming towards me. I won't give away the region I live in, but we don't have many gators or crocs around here, and judging by the movement of the water, it seemed too big to be anything else. I turned and ran to the house. When I made it to the porch, I spared a quick look at the same time as I opened the door. Now there was a split second between me looking and me running into the house. During that very short time frame, I could have sworn I thought I saw something round poking out of the water close to shore. It didn't look anything like Agatha. In fact, it almost seemed like the upper half of a head sticking out and peering at me, like someone was swimming in that dirty old still pond. When I went into Grandpa's room to alert him, he was already awake, standing at his window looking down into the yard. His window faced the pond, so I wondered if he could see it, but when I stood beside him and followed his gaze all the way down to the water, I saw nothing. He didn't say anything. He was staring into space again. "Grandpa, is there something in the pond?" I asked, still breathing hard from running. He didn't answer me. "Grandpa, answer me. I'm getting scared." meat. What? I shook his arm, watching his stoic expression for any sign of emotion. After a second, he turned to me quickly, as if only just realizing I was there beside him. In the blink of an eye, his face turned red, and veins bulged in his forehead. "Go clean the kitchen, boy." I was taken aback by his hostile tone that came out of nowhere, so much so that I said nothing and left to do as he said. He didn't ask if I wanted to be told a bedtime story that night, nor did he pray with me. In fact, all I could hear until I finally passed out from exhaustion was him pacing his bedroom floor aggressively, ranting loud enough for me to hear but not loud enough for me to know what he was talking about. Whatever it was, it had him madder than I'd ever seen him. The next morning I could hear Grandpa in the kitchen. This made me happy as I got up to brush my teeth, because I thought since he was back into his routine then, that must have meant he was feeling better. As I went downstairs, I smiled, hearing him humming a tune to an old song playing from his radio, but my smile disappeared as the stench of smoke hit my nose. Grandpa slammed plates of overcooked food down on the table with such hostility it made me jump. Despite the anger in his actions, he had a small smile on his wrinkled face, not a big one, a simple, tiny curl of his thin lips. He didn't once look at me as he started digging into the blackened and charred eggs and grits on his plate with a knife and fork. He ate with such gusto, humming louder and louder between bites, his movements becoming faster and more frenzied. He sliced and sliced with his knife and stabbed with his fork, the sound of the metal scraping against china grating my ears. I watched him, too afraid to ask what was wrong, and too afraid to leave the table because I knew the rule was that I had to be excused first, and I didn't want to make him angry. I remembered something then. "Grandpa, we didn't say grace." I flinched when his eyes met mine, and all movement on him ceased. He didn't say anything for a moment, but then he returned to his regular self. No creepy smile and no anger, and nodded at me while patting his mouth with a napkin. If anything, he seemed sheepish that he'd forgotten. "Good boy for remembering. It's not too late. Go on, it's your turn this time." I closed my eyes and pressed my hands together before reciting the words I'd memorized years ago. God is good. God is great. Thank you for this bountiful food, and thank you for keeping us healthy and safe. As I prayed, I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Something felt utterly wrong. I cracked open one eye. "And thank you for..." Grandpa wasn't praying with me at all. His eyes weren't closed, and his head wasn't bowed. His hands rested on the table as he glared at me with such deep hatred and vitriol that I feared for my life for the first time ever. His fingers rested tensely on his fork, twitching like they itched to grab it and plunge it into my body. Even if it weren't for his expression, something about the fact that he was staring at me like that as I prayed, during a time where his eyes were meant to be closed in prayer with me, made me deeply uncomfortable. What had I done that was so wrong? I started to tear up a little. I got up from the table, no longer caring about the rule. "I'm not hungry, I'm going to my room." He watched me with his unwavering, rage-filled gaze, not bothering to respond. His eyes never left me until I turned the corner down the hall. Shutting myself in my room, I tried to think of what to do. I thought of calling my mom using the landline in the kitchen, but would he even let me? I stayed there, reading a book, when I heard slow, methodical footsteps approach the door. I could see the shadows of Grandpa's feet through the crack under it. The doorknob turned, but of course I had locked the door because I didn't want him to bother me, so he wasn't able to get in. "Grandpa, please." "Please what?" "Please let him in." I mustered the courage to defy him and said in a loud voice, "Leave me alone." A beat of silence passed. "I'm not your grandfather, you little piece of shit." My mouth fell open. He'd never sworn at me like that before, not even when I broke a plate or stepped on his bad foot. His voice was low, raspy, and deeper than it usually was. I listened to the sound of him walking away back down the hall towards his own room. I needed to call my mum. I waited until I was sure he wasn't coming back out anytime soon, and then I crept into the hall and made my way quietly into the kitchen. I remembered Mom's phone number by heart, so I punched it into the keys and held the white phone to my ear as it rang. My hands were sweaty, and I felt like every little creak of the house settling was actually my grandfather coming. "Hello?" "Mom," I whispered, looking over my shoulder. "Grandpa's acting weird." I don't want to stay here anymore. Can you come get me today? Eric, what are you talking about? Your father and I are too busy to pick you up. We planned this summer last year. I think he has some old people sickness or something, I said, trying to remember the term dementia or Alzheimer's at the time. He's freaking me out. I can't stay here for a whole summer. Please pick me up. I'm scared. Honey, your father and I are in New York City. We're going to board the ship tomorrow morning at the port. We can't come get you. What's going on? Dunno, he's angry all the time and keeps staring at nothing. And he keeps trying to get into my row room. Maybe he's a grumpy old man, you know this, and wait, trying to get into your room. Eric, did you lock your door? You know that's against the rules. Yeah, I locked it because he's being weird and I heard a floorboard groan ever so slightly behind me, and I turned around, dropping the phone. It clacked against the wall hanging by the cord. Grandpa was standing in the kitchen entrance, completely blocking the way out, and staring with that empty, dead, slack-jawed expression from before. Eric? Eric? Mum's voice came from the phone. The corners of Grandpa's lips yanked up into a demented smile, showing yellowed, rotten teeth I don't remember him having. In fact, I specifically remembered that he always prided himself on his hygiene and meticulously brushed and flossed his teeth twice, sometimes even 3 times, a day. Now they looked like they were ready to fall out, brown ooze dripping from the top row. He advanced towards me, shuffling like a zombie, and I let out a little yelp and dodged him, running out of the way. I turned and realized, my heart going wild in my chest, that he wasn't after me. He simply went over and picked up the phone, slowly bringing it up to his face, his eyes more dark and cold than a shark's, never leaving mine. Charlene stood in the kitchen entryway and listened to their conversation, feeling more helpless than ever. Oh, no need to worry yourself, my dear. All is fine, and well, the boy and I simply had a disagreement. He grinned at me as he saw my face fall. Oh yes, I'll make sure he behaves from now on. You just relax, Athome. Okay, take care. He placed the phone back on the receiver and just stood there in that same position, baring his gnarly teeth at me sadistically, as if breathing in my fear. There were no words. I simply turned around and hurried back to my room. I felt his stare burning holes into my back as I did. Once I locked the door behind me, I crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to my neck. The sun was setting outside, and I knew it would be hard getting to sleep that night. At around 1 a.m., I found myself starting to drift off finally, until I heard noises in the living room. I couldn't help it. I was too curious and figured I could be stealthy enough to not be caught out of my room at this hour. I snuck down to the center of the stairway and watched Grandpa in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by broken and knocked over furniture, tear into one of the steaks he'd left to thaw out the previous day. He was naked as the day he was, born and standing there in the dark, hunched over, tearing into bloody red slabs of raw meat with his rotten teeth like a savage animal. He was even grunting and growling under his breath as he did it. I didn't know what to do or say. I definitely didn't want him to know I was there, and I was afraid to go back up the stairs, in fear I made a noise that would alert him to my presence. The air in the house felt freezing cold, where normally Grandpa kept it hot, and there was a bad odor that couldn't just be explained by him not showering in a while or something. It smelled like rot, and it certainly wasn't the once frozen meat. I also noticed that the things that were hanging on the dining room wall had been taken down. The Last Supper painting was lying on the floor with rips and punctures in it, and the Holy Crosses lying there, with it burned in some places, as if he'd held a lighter to them, or something. Above all, the detail that stood out the most to me was that he was soaking wet. Now, I hadn't heard the bath running at all, so the only other explanation was that he'd been in the pond. The dirty, wet footprints leading from the slightly ajar front door supported my theory. It was then that I knew for sure that something paranormal may have been happening to him. This was beyond an episode of dementia or something, or at least that's what my preteen brain thought at the time, since Grandpa was extremely religious and would not dare do that to the symbols of Christianity around his house. This had to be related to the thing I saw in the pond. I started slowly making my way back up the stairs. Thankfully, he didn't hear me, and I carefully shut the door and locked it. Once that was done, I quietly started gathering my things. I changed out of my pajamas into street clothes I would feel comfortable running in and packed my backpack so, I wouldn't have to return. My plan was to go to the neighbors a couple miles up the road. I never met them. I just saw the house pass by during trips in the car with Grandpa and saw that it was a family with 2 parents and a couple of kids too young for school. I was going to tell them that I felt unsafe and that Grandpa needed help and give them my mom's number. All I had to do to make this plan work was get out of the house without him noticing me. I waited in bed for a couple of hours until I heard all the noises cease. I wasn't out of the clear entirely though, because Grandpa didn't go back upstairs to sleep in his room. I heard him open the front door and it seemed like he hadn't returned by then. I looked out my window, which faced the side of the yard where the pond started, but saw nothing. I even opened the window a crack to see if I could hear him out there, but I heard nothing. Absolutely zilch, not even crickets and cicadas chirping, an owl, a bat, nothing at all. The world was silent and dead, making me feel like I was the only one in it, the only one aside from my disturbing grandfather. I eventually gathered myself to the point where I could leave the room without passing out from fear. I silently went downstairs, through the dining room, into the living room, and out the wide-open front door. I looked around while standing on the porch. Seeing that the yard was empty instilled me with much-needed confidence. I walked across the front lawn, and I made it exactly to the middle when I heard the water from the pond burbling. I looked in that direction. Of course, I could barely see anything since I didn't have a flashlight, and the moonlight was not very bright at all. I did hear something though, an old man's voice whispered, reaching my ear closely as if carried by the breeze. "Summer isn't over, Eric." I ran towards the road and made a sharp left turn. I could hear him laughing, cackling like a madman, as sounds of something emerging from the pond, water splashing, cut through the silence. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, and my lungs felt like raisins. I heard wet feet slapping the asphalt behind me as something followed me, but I didn't dare look. Eventually, the sounds faded away, but I couldn't tell if it was because he stopped chasing me or because of how loud my heart was pumping in my ears. It felt like a lifetime until I reached that house I remember seeing. The lights in the windows slowly turned on as I banged on the door urgently, crying for help. This area was more lively, with fireflies glowing and toads croaking in general, nightlife chorusing around me as it should. The mom and dad of that family let me sit on the couch and gave me something to eat and drink, as they called my parents and the police. Arguably, this is the worst part of the story, even though it takes place after Hiskabet. When the police came to check on my grandpa, they didn't find him in the house at all. He was in the pond, and he was dead. He had been dead for quite a while, actually, since the night I came, which obviously didn't make sense, but the evidence was there. His corpse was decayed, the process being hastened by the hot summer sun, naked and bloated as it bobbed in the pond. My family didn't sugarcoat this to me at all, being that I kept insisting the police were wrong and that he was alive that night. Brought up the phone call and Mom denied it even more. She refuses to believe that even happened, to the point she yells at me when I bring it up. Dad told me she was drinking that night I called. They were celebrating before getting on the cruise. He thinks I impersonated Grandpa, and that she was so drunk she thought I was actually him. I thought she sounded pretty sober though. I think deep down she knows something paranormal wash happening, but doesn't want to face it. My mom also told me, when my dad wasn't around, that Grandma died by drowning in that very same pond. It confused everyone, because she never attempted swimming in it, and she didn't have anything wrong with her mentally. Yet it seemed like she intended to jump in, as she'd taken off her clothes, socks and shoes and neatly folded them on the bank. She was found floating in the center, with a look of slack-jawed confusion on her face, the same as Grandpa years later. Mom believes that she committed suicide because she was unhappy with Grandpa for a long time. She believes Grandpa killed himself too, and my brain made me hallucinate that he was still alive to cope after seeing him drown. I don't think so though. I think something's really wrong about that place, and that it took its time before claiming my grandpa. You're free to have your own opinions though.